like to do now is kind of move on and take a quick look at what this traditional selection process looked like that I would argue the majority of those companies that George explored with Deloitte & Touche went through as well in landing on a solution set that fundamentally didn't work for their business. So most organizations that we get engaged with work on sort of a two-filter basis when they look at selecting a piece of software. So, that first selection criteria really falls out of a criteria list that they put together internally. It has to have this functionality and this capability, and it has to have these, this technology infrastructure. Then they go out to the market and they cast the net quite wide, and they land on a handful of different potential solutions that seem to make sense. So that's kind of that first filter, is what's the category of software that we should be looking at. And then the second filter gets down into three core areas, which is functional adequacy, technology factors, and then price and licensing. So if you look at this second set of filters and kind of compare it to the Deloitte study that George was engaged with, it starts to look the same. So out of that second filter, organizations are looking at demos. They're looking at the integration into the underlying technology that they've already made some investments in. And then they're looking at prices of the software and the implementation and the licensing itself. And out of that will fall a proposal. The proposal gets vetted, and one of the partners gets selected to implement moving forward. My suspicion is, if you're listening in on this call, your organization probably uses a similar selection process, not just for software, but for the majority of the IT-related technologies that get selected. And so we sometimes look at buying business application software not dissimilarly from buying a new server or a new set of printers for the organization. So let's cast the net wide, let's look at the various suppliers, let's get crystal clear on what our capabilities and functionality is we're looking for, and then let's get a proposal that has some price involved in it. Right? So if we harken back to where we started, which is why do these projects run into challenges, what you'll find is that we start to see how this outcome starts to form right at the beginning here. So that's the traditional selection process. What I also want to talk to now is the actual buying process, the customer buying process. And this, to me, is absolutely fascinating. If you look at the grid that I've got on the screen here, it comes out of a publication called The New Solution Selling, a revolutionary sales process that is changing the way people sell. And while it was published in 2004, it is fundamentally the root of all solution selling that is effectively being practiced out there in the field today. But what it speaks to is what's happening on the customer buying side. So if we look at phase one, which is the beginning phase of determining what solution do we want to look at, there's four categories of activities. The first one is needs. Right? So what are our specific needs as a corporation or as a company related to this project? And that typically, as you would expect, has the highest priority. Now right underneath that is what's the cost. We're going to do an initial first filter on solutions that we can afford. Right underneath that is what's the solution that the organizations we're going to talk to, the vendor community, do they offer? And at the lowest level is risk. So just think about how you're engaging in your current software selection process. So at the beginning of this process, you're looking at what do I most need? As we move through the next phase, phase 2 and phase 3, where we start to evaluate the alternatives, our focus changes significantly. As we go into phase 2, we start to put more time on the solutions that are being offered out there by the different vendors and local partners. And this is where we fundamentally look at all of the product demonstrations. The lowest point of interest at this point is the cost. Right? Now, risk starts to rise a little bit through this. As an organization, you get a little bit closer to actually making a decision. And then once we get into phase 3, risk is at its premium, primarily because you're about to make a choice, and you're going to have to live with that choice for a long period of time. And also you're moving into pricing and negotiation. And of course, as you would expect, the cost of that solution becomes highly important to the buyers, and the need and the solution itself are of low importance because you've landed on a vendor to move forward with. Right? So this is the buying pattern that is driving selling behavior. So if you have a buying community that is completely ignoring the high level of risk of these projects at the beginning, and you have a selling community that is ignoring the high failure rate of these projects, you end up, what these fundamentally drive is the outcomes that we've seen at the beginning with the Standish Group. So what I would highly recommend, big believer in contrarian approaches to these types of projects, is that we take this element of risk at the beginning of this process and start to drive it up to the top of the level of concern rather than leave it to the end after you've picked a vendor to negotiate with. And then what I'm going to talk to as we go through some of the balance of the presentation today is why that is so important and why it's important to start to evaluate the solution providers based on their engagement at this level as well. Because the more mature ones, the more experienced ones, the ones that have the most value, the ones that can de-risk this 65% failure rate are the ones that are going to be most willing to engage with you at the beginning on the issues that are most important, which is, you know what, there's some risk behind this project.
And there's risk in every project, Mark?
I would argue that there's absolute risk in every single project.
I would agree. It's a funny thing. Most people don't want to talk about that, but there's risks, and if we don't talk about them, we can't manage them. We can't mitigate them, right? And so, you know, it's one thing, and maybe not everyone on the call didn't want to hear that today, but yeah, we're about to embark on a project that has risk, and we have to be very cognizant of that and manage it carefully.
Yeah, I would agree. And the interesting thing, in my own personal experience around this, George, is that when either myself or organizations that I work with have been invited in by companies that are looking at, you know, new software solutions, they typically don't want to have that conversation around risk at all. But when I broach it as a significant issue that we need to talk about early, they said, well, you know, we'll kind of get to that first, but we'd really like to, or later, but we'd really like to see some of your software first. And as we'll kind of talk to as, you know, the presentation later today, you know, watching software is the easiest part of this project. It's the easiest part of the project. The hardest work is identifying where the risks sit early enough in your selection process to actually have an impact on which selection you make in the end is the right one for your company.
And I just want to add one more thing here, because I was thinking about the one question I ask companies when they want to implement software. I always ask them, which of the executive team members is staking their job on the success of this project? And that goes back to that, you know, that lack of executive support and why projects fail. So if there's no executive that's willing to stake their career on the success of this project, you know, regardless of how big that project is, your chance of success is diminished.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I would completely agree.
And I'll let you go back to your slides. I'm sorry to get derailed.
Yeah. So what I want to do now is I want to take a look at a typical customer buying process as we experience them on a consistent basis, so that we can contrast and compare that to a new approach that we're going to recommend, you know, a little bit later in this conversation. So what I know to be true about the majority of the customer buying processes that I have been engaged in over the years, and I have to believe, I haven't done a count, but there's hundreds if not thousands of these things, they all follow a pretty traditional and typical process. So most organizations don't wake up one morning and say, gee, today's the day we're going to go and we're going to buy some new, you know, enterprise resource planning software, some new customer relationship management software. There's always some trigger event that occurs that it really initiates this project. And so typically there is a functional challenge that's identified somewhere in the company. And these are not generally insignificant. These functional challenges sound like, I can't move the business forward. We're losing customers. We can't report accurately. You know, there's something significant that happens, and then someone says, well, geez, if we made an investment in either upgrading or replacing the software that we have, that problem would go away. So these functional challenges are identified out of the gate. We need this, 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 and this, in this new solution set. Now what they then do with that is define specific requirements falling out of those business challenges. And then what they do is go out to the vendor community and look at, you know, who out there should we explore as a potential solution provider to solve these business problems. And then there's a sub-process that happens. It just starts with a request for a proposal, what George and I refer to as a request for punishment, which is we've now taken all of these requirements, we've documented them, typically in a multi-hundred or multi-thousand line spreadsheet, and then we're going to toss these over the fence to the vendor community, and then they're going to respond to these. What we're going to provide with regards to access is some structured discovery. So we're going to set up a couple of meetings where these various solution providers can come in and learn a little bit more about our business. And that typically involves a very limited amount of executive access. So typically the people that are sharing what the business problems are 9 times out of 10 fundamentally at an operational level, which is not a bad thing at all, but they are reluctant to open up access to the executives to learn about what the business challenges are at the highest level. Now, out of that structured discovery come product demonstrations, generally to a committee of some kind, and then there's an evaluation process of the proposals, and then one of the vendors is selected, and then out of that, there's a business impact of sorts that the organization realizes, and hopefully that business impact is the one that was anticipated when the initial functional challenges were identified at the beginning. But if we go back to the Standish data, what we know to be true is that in better than 65% of the cases, that process leads to